Running for president in 1980, Ronald Reagan was asked by U.S. News & World Report, October 6, 1980 issue, if he was not proposing substantially what President Carter had proposed as a candidate 4 years earlier: lower taxes, cuts in spending and major reductions in the federal bureaucracy. Mr. Reagan answered, "Yes, but with an important difference: I intend to keep my promises." In the years following that interview, Ronald Reagan has been elected president twice and has compiled an extensive record in that office. In spite of controversies such as the Iran-Contra affair, he has been and continues to be a popular president. Yet, like Jimmy Carter before him, Mr. Reagan has failed to keep many of his promises. Moreover, Mr. Reagan's official policies as president have often conflicted with his conservative image. It is, of course, true that the president is not responsible for everything that happens in Washington. The U.S. Constitution delegates to Congress, not to the president, the authority to make the nation's laws. Oftentimes President Reagan has not had the support of the Congress, particularly the heavily Democratic House. Nevertheless, the president does have some influence with the Congress. The president is responsible for that influence when he uses it to support or oppose legislation. The president is also responsible for the public statements that he makes and the official directives, orders, and other documents that go out over his signature. And he is responsible for how he conducts the foreign affairs of the nation. Many patriotic Americans believe that Ronald Reagan is a great conservative, anti-communist president. The record shows, however, that the Reagan administration is neither conservative nor anti-communist. In the survey that follows, many of the facts are disturbing. Our purpose in presenting these facts is not to destroy hope in a conservative, anti-communist president but to create it. Unless we are willing to know the truth and to act on it, we will continue to be fooled by candidates for any elected office who promise one thing and do another. The federal budget. On the campaign trail in 1980, Mr. Reagan promised to balance the federal budget in fiscal 1983. Not only was the budget not balanced, but the deficit that year was $208 billion, the largest up to that time in the history of our nation. Shortly after becoming president, Mr. Reagan pushed his target date for a balanced budget back 1 year, from fiscal 1983 to fiscal 1984. In fiscal 1984 the deficit was $185 billion. Immediately after being sworn in as the 40th President of the United States, Mr. Reagan stated in his inaugural address, "It is time to check and reverse the growth of government which shows signs of having grown beyond the consent of the governed." He added, "It is my intention to curb the size and influence of the federal establishment and to demand recognition of the distinction between the powers granted to the federal government and those reserved to the states or to the people." Many Americans have assumed by such statements that Mr. Reagan at least intended to cut the size and cost of government. This assessment, however, does not hold up against reality. As president, Mr. Reagan has submitted a total of 8 budget proposals to the Congress, including his March 1981 revision of Mr. Carter's fiscal 1982 budget. These budget proposals reveal several facts. Mr. Reagan's budget proposals without exception called for a deficit for the upcoming fiscal year. The smallest deficit he proposed was $59 billion, fiscal 1982. And the largest deficit was $203 billion, fiscal 1984. Mr. Reagan's budget proposals without exception called for an overall increase in spending. In his fiscal 1982 proposal, he recommended spending less than what Mr. Carter had recommended for the same fiscal year, $709 billion as compared to $758 billion. But this amount was still greater than what was actually spent the previous fiscal year, $678 billion. Mr. Reagan's budget proposals generally call for an overall increase in revenues, taxes, But how about the much publicized budget cuts that Mr. Reagan had proposed? How could Mr. Reagan have asked Congress to cut the budget and at the same time still propose a larger budget? The answer is that the so-called cuts in the budget were never cuts in the absolute sense. In an address before a joint session of Congress on February 18, 1981, on the subject of his economic recovery program, Mr. Reagan himself explained, "It's important to note that we're only reducing the rate of increase in taxing and spending. We're not attempting to cut either spending or taxing levels below that which we presently have, and I'm asking that you join me in reducing direct federal spending by $41.4 billion in fiscal year 1982, and this goes along with another $7.7 billion in user fees and off-budget savings for a total of $49.1 billion. And this will still allow an increase of $40.8 billion over 1981 spending." Mr. Reagan did not have to propose overall increases in taxes and spending, he could have proposed overall tax and spending reductions. He did not have to propose only that the expected rate of increase in federal spending be cut, he could have proposed absolute reductions below the previous fiscal year's spending level. He was not forced to propose budgets drenched in red ink, he could have proposed balanced budgets, or even budget surpluses. Of course, Congress could have disregarded any such proposals and gone ahead with its big spending legislation anyway. Nevertheless, the President did not give Congress that option. If the President had really intended to cut the budget in the true sense, he would have at least tried. If he had tried, and then failed, the fault would have been wholly with the Congress. Instead, the President must share at least some of the blame for what has actually happened to the federal budget. It is instructive to compare federal spending during Mr. Carter's term in office to spending under Mr. Reagan's term to date. Federal outlays under Mr. Reagan have increased not only in actual dollar amounts but as a percentage of the gross national product and in real, constant dollar terms. In fiscal 1987, constant dollar spending fell below the previous year's spending, the first time this had occurred in 14 years, but not below spending levels during the Carter era. Moreover, Mr. Reagan's own Office of Management and Budget is estimating an increase in real terms this year, fiscal 1988, over fiscal 1987. The growth in federal revenues generally has not kept pace with the growth in federal outlays over most of the Reagan years, and this has caused the deficits to soar. Mr. Reagan can, and should, claim some credit for slowing the growth rate of federal spending. Nevertheless, even with a slow rate of growth, the burden of the government on the American people will continue to grow worse. National debt limit. The annual budget deficits become a part of the national debt. The national debt limit puts a ceiling on the amount of money that the federal government may borrow. Raising the limit allows the federal government to borrow more money. On January 28, 1981, only 8 days after Mr. Reagan's inauguration, the administration asked Congress to raise the national debt limit from $935 billion to $985 billion. In a nationwide address on February 5, Mr. Reagan explained why he had taken this action. Today the national debt is $934 billion. So-called temporary increases or extensions in the debt ceiling have been allowed 21 times these last 10 years, and now I've been forced to ask for another increase in the debt ceiling or the government will be unable to function past the middle of February, the president continued. Before we reach the day when we can reduce the debt ceiling, we may in spite of our best efforts see a national debt in excess of $1 trillion. Now, this is a figure that's literally beyond our comprehension. During 1981, the national debt limit was first raised to $985 billion, winning the president his first legislative victory. Then, with Reagan's blessing, it was raised in excess of $1 trillion. Since 1981, the national debt limit has been raised in a series of steps to its present level of $2.8 trillion, a level that the federal government is not expected to reach until May 1989. Budget balancing. Mr. Reagan supported the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985, commonly referred to as the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act, after its three original Senate sponsors. The legislation set maximum allowable deficits for fiscal years 1986-91, declining to zero in fiscal 1991. It included an automatic procedure for cutting spending that would go into effect if the deficit targets were not met. That procedure was later deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Congress passed this legislation as an amendment to a bill that pushed the debt limit over $2 trillion. Thus, voting for an increase in the debt limit was made less of a political hot potato. Gramm-Rudman-Hollings was enacted in spite of the fact that there was already a law on the books, PL 95-435, requiring balanced federal budgets beginning in fiscal 1981. That law was ignored, leaving us little confidence that the new law would be adhered to any more closely. Then, on September 23, 1987, Mr. Reagan signed the amended version of the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings legislation, which, like the original version, was attached to legislation increasing the national debt limit. The new version revised the automatic spending procedure. And it eased the deficit targets, changing from fiscal 1991 to fiscal 1993, the year by which a balanced budget is to be achieved. It is perhaps better to support a balanced budget for some future fiscal year than not to support one at all, but it is also expedient, since support for a future balanced budget reduces the political pressures for achieving one now. Mr. Reagan will not be in the White House when either the fiscal 1991 or the fiscal 1993 budget is considered. Mr. Reagan has recommended a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, as well as a line-item veto. Specific tax proposals. There are two ways to achieve a balanced budget. One is to raise taxes and the other is to cut spending. Thus, a balanced budget does not necessarily mean a frugal federal government. So far as taxes are concerned, Mr. Reagan has proposed cuts but has recommended increases as well. Economic Recovery Act. During his first year as president, Mr. Reagan succeeded in getting his program for economic recovery through Congress. Known as the Economic Recovery Act of 1981, it reduced individual income tax rates across the board by about 23% in 3 stages. It also provided certain business, savings, and investment incentives. Called the largest tax cut in American history, the entire package was expected to reduce taxes on individuals and businesses by $749 billion over 5 years. However, in order for the total federal tax burden to be reduced by $749 billion, the total cost of government would have to be reduced by the same amount. As Mr. Reagan himself stated in his January 25, 1984 State of the Union address, whether government borrows or increases taxes, it will be taking the same amount from the private sector, and, either way, that's too much. Because federal spending was not cut, the $749 billion still came from the private sector, only in the form of deficits rather than taxes. Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act. In a December 23, 1981 question and answer session with reporters, Mr. Reagan was asked about the possibility of tax increases. He stated, "Well, there certainly will be no change in taxes in 1982. I guarantee you." During 1982, Mr. Reagan supported the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act, which raised taxes an estimated $214.1 billion over 5 years and was called the largest peacetime tax increase in American history. Gasoline tax hike. In a news conference on September 28, 1982, the president was asked specifically if he could assure the American people now that you'll flatly rule out any tax increases, revenue enhancers, or specifically an increase in the gasoline tax. He answered, "Unless there's a palace coup and I'm overtaken, laughter, or overthrown, no, I don't see the necessity for that." Shortly thereafter, he came out in support of a 5-cent per gallon increase in the gasoline tax. In addition, this same legislative package increased levies on the trucking industry. The total increase was estimated at $5.5 billion a year. Social Security Act amendments. In 1977, Congress raised Social Security payroll taxes by an estimated $227 billion over a 10-year period. In an election season interview appearing in the October 6, 1980 issue of U.S. News & World Report, Mr. Reagan voiced his disapproval of Jimmy Carter's support of this type of legislation. Mr. Carter has done nothing about it, Social Security, he said, except to impose the biggest single tax increase on the people in our country's history, by way of the Social Security tax. In 1983, the president supported Social Security legislation that raised an estimated $165 billion over 7 years, rising to a total of almost $1.9 trillion over a 75-year period. Interest and dividend tax withholding. The Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982 imposed a 10% withholding tax on interest and dividends, to become effective on July 1, 1983. It would have increased tax collections by an estimated $13.4 billion over 6 years. Mr. Reagan opposed legislation to repeal this withholding tax, but later backed down in his threat to veto the repeal. The addition of special tax incentives for Caribbean nations and stiffer withholding requirements, as well as the lopsided votes by which the repeal legislation passed both houses of Congress, helped to win his signature on the bill. Deficit Reduction Act. In his remarks at a rally in Atlanta on January 26, 1984, Mr. Reagan stated, "We face large deficits, and there's no disagreement about the need to bring those deficits down. The disagreement is over how we do it, with spending cuts and economic growth or through tax increases. Well, I happen to believe responsible budgeting does not mean routing more and more of your earnings to Washington, D.C. Later in the same speech, he stated, "We don't face large deficits because you're not taxed enough. We face those deficits because government still spends too much." 6 days later, in his message to Congress transmitting his fiscal 1985 budget proposal, he stated, "To those who say we must raise taxes, I say wait." Later in 1984, Mr. Reagan supported the Deficit Reduction Act. The act cut the deficit an estimated $63 billion by raising taxes $50 billion while cutting spending by only $13 billion. Tax Reform Act. During the presidential campaign of 1984, Democratic opponent Walter Mondale claimed that, regardless of who was elected president, taxes would go up. He accused Mr. Reagan of having a secret plan to raise taxes. Ronald Reagan, however, denied any such plans, claiming at one point that any tax increases from our side would be over my dead body. What Mr. Reagan promised instead of tax increases was tax reform. In his State of the Union address for that year, he helped to set the tone for the campaign by stating, "Let us go forward with an historic reform for fairness, simplicity, and incentives for growth." Most voters favored Mr. Reagan's position on taxes over Mr. Mondale's position, a factor that no doubt contributed to Mr. Reagan's landslide victory in November. Mr. Reagan made tax reform a top priority for his second term. On May 28, 1985 he submitted his tax reform proposals to the American people in a nationally televised address from the Oval Office. At that time he stated, "I believe that, in both spirit and substance, our tax system has come to be un-American." And, later in his speech, comparing the distance between the present system and our proposal is like comparing the distance between a Model T and the Space Shuttle. There were differences, of course, between Mr. Reagan's original proposal and the final bill passed by Congress, but Mr. Reagan was still a strong supporter of the legislation that he had helped to push through Congress. When he signed the bill on October 22, 1986, He stated, "I feel like we just played the World Series of tax reform, laughter, and the American people won." Most of the effects of the Tax Reform Act of 1986 were not felt by the American people until 1988, when they filed their income tax forms for the 1987 tax year. At that time, it became apparent to most that the new tax reform legislation was not all that it was promised to be. Both Mr. Reagan's original proposal and the new law were designed to be revenue neutral. That is to say, both Mr. Reagan and the lawmakers took for granted that the federal government needed to maintain its present high level of taxation, rather than cut taxes in the overall sense. What the new law did do was shift the tax burden in various ways. For instance, individual income tax collections were reduced by an estimated $120 billion over 5 years. But corporation taxes were increased by this same amount over the same period of time. There were phased-in reductions in the top individual tax rate and in the number of income tax brackets. The standard personal deduction was increased, and many familiar deductions were eliminated or reduced. Rather than reducing taxes overall, the new law purports to make every taxpayer pay his fair share. Grace Commission. In 1982, Mr. Reagan established by executive order the President's Private Sector Survey on Cost Control in the federal government. The commission was chaired by J. Peter Grace and was commonly referred to as the Grace Commission. The commission's report, released in January 1984, made 2,478 recommendations, or 1,635 recommendations when overlapping recommendations are eliminated, for estimated savings of $424 billion over 3 years. These recommendations were based on eliminating waste and abuse and making federal operations more efficient. They were not based on changing basic federal policies. What happened to the Grace Commission? According to Mr. Reagan's budget proposal for fiscal 1986, 70% of these recommendations have been carried out or are being proposed with the 1986 budget. The remaining 30% are undergoing further review. Most of the recommendations, 879, have already been implemented and 269 are being transmitted with the 1986 budget. Yet, the federal budget continued to grow. Why? Congressional Quarterly reported in its May 11, 1985 issue, most of the 2,478 recommendations of merit, according to a study by the General Accounting Office, GAO. However, Comptroller General Charles A. Bosher, who heads GAO, told the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee May 9 that most of the worthwhile recommendations of the survey would increase management efficiency, rather than save billions of dollars, as the survey had anticipated. Energy and education depths. When Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980, he promised to abolish the departments of energy and education. Shortly after becoming president, he was asked during a news conference, January 29, 1981, if he intended to follow through on these campaign pledges. He replied, "I have not retreated from that at all. The process, however, that I have asked for is for both Secretary Bell of Education and Secretary Jim Edwards of Energy to reorganize, to produce the most efficient streamlining of their departments that they can. In education, to look at the appropriate role of the federal government in education, if there is one, and to report back. And then we will decide, making our recommendations." Mr. Reagan's most recent budget proposal called for fiscal 1989 outlays of $22.7 billion for the Education Department and $3.1 billion for the energy function of government. Energy function outlays do not include spending for the defense-related atomic energy programs that the Department of Energy handles. Foreign aid. Mr. Reagan understood many of the flaws of the U.S. foreign aid program when, in a 1964 speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater's presidential bid, he pointed out how some of the money had been spent. "We bought dress suits for Greek undertakers. We bought 1,000 TV sets with 23-inch screens for a country where there is no electricity, and some of our foreign aid funds provided extra wives for Kenya government officials." He added, when Congress moved to cut foreign aid, they were told that if they cut $1 they endangered national security. Presumably, Mr. Reagan was then in favor of cutting foreign aid. As president, however, he has not only supported the program but has fought for larger amounts of foreign aid than Congress was willing to pass. For instance, in his first year in the White House, Mr. Reagan asked the Congress to appropriate $7,775,098,683 for foreign assistance and related programs in fiscal 1982. Congress approved $7,495,221,970 to 4% less than what the president had requested. In fact, this legislation was the first regular foreign aid appropriations bill enacted since 1978. Foreign aid programs had become such a political hot potato in recent years that they could only be passed in continuing resolutions that funded a multitude of other government programs. But Mr. Reagan got the needed Republican support for the Foreign Aid Appropriations Bill as well as for the authorization. The Congressional Quarterly Almanac, 1981, summarized. Previous Republican attacks on Democrats who backed foreign aid, plus the unpleasant specter of voting to spend money abroad after making deep cuts in the domestic budget, led the Democratic House majority to await GOP leadership on the aid authorization bill. The situation was turned around when Reagan and Secretary of State Alexander M. Haig Jr. issued personal appeals to their party the week of December 7 to get the Reagan foreign aid program through Congress. In 1983, Mr. Reagan asked Congress to increase by $8.4 billion the U.S. contribution to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, an international lending agency. On June 6 of that year, he sent a letter to the U.S. Senate arguing that passage of this legislation is of the utmost importance to the world economy, to the strength of the recovery and to the U.S. position of leadership in world affairs. In both the House and the Senate, the Congress considered an amendment to this legislation that would have required the United States to oppose loans by the IMF to communist dictatorships. Although the president opposed the amendment, the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee sent out press releases attacking Democrats who had also opposed it. 7 of the Democrats who were targets of the release complained in a letter to the president, "At the very least, those of us who have been targeted with this demagogic attack deserve assurances from you that our support for administration positions will not be distorted for political purposes." The Congress went on to pass an $8.4 billion authorization and appropriation for the IMF as part of a package of legislation that also included an authorization of $15.6 billion for housing programs, a 3-year extension of the authorization for the Export-Import Bank, during which time the bank was expected to make $14.1 billion in new direct loans, and authorizations of $5.2 billion for the Inter-American Development Bank and $1.3 billion for the Asian Development Bank. When this huge legislative package reached the president's desk, the president signed it into law. In 1987, Mr. Reagan opposed House passage of a bill to authorize $11.4 billion in fiscal 1988 and $11.5 billion in fiscal 1989 for foreign aid programs. He did so, however, on the grounds that it did not provide enough money and that it would impair his flexibility in carrying out his foreign policy. National Defense. On May 25, 1983, Mr. Reagan's Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, told the graduating class at the U.S. Naval Academy, "Within weeks many of you will be looking across just hundreds of feet of water at some of the most modern technology ever invented in America. Unfortunately, it is on Soviet ships. It makes little sense for the United States to spend $300 billion on defense and at the same time assist its adversary. Mr. Reagan has not reversed that policy of helping communism, which has continued unabated during both Republican and Democratic administrations, but he has launched a program of military modernization. As a result of this emphasis, the percentage of federal outlays devoted to national defense has grown from 23% in fiscal 1981 to 28% in fiscal 1987. SDI. On March 23, 1983, Mr. Reagan addressed the nation on the subject of peace and national security. In that speech, the president asked, "What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?" He answered, "I know this is a formidable, technical task, one that may not be accomplished before the end of this century. Yet, current technology has attained a level of sophistication where it is reasonable to begin this effort." Thus was launched the research program of missile defense, dubbed Star Wars by the press, that later became officially known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. Americans concerned with the threat to freedom posed by the Soviet Union applauded Mr. Reagan's initiative. Yet, many of those same Americans seemed not to notice when, on the following occasions, Mr. Reagan suggested sharing with the Soviet Union the anti-missile technology developed by the United States. March 29, 1983, during an interview in the Oval Office with 6 reporters, the president stated his opinion that, if a defensive weapon could be found and developed that would reduce the utility of these missiles, or maybe even make them obsolete, then whenever that time came, a president of the United States could, as one of his options, offer to give that same defensive weapon to them, the Soviets, to prove to them that there was no longer any need for keeping these missiles. November 21, 1985, after returning from his Geneva summit meeting with Gorbachev, the president stated in a nationwide address, "I described our proposal for a reciprocal program of open laboratories in strategic defense research. I promised that if our research reveals that a defense against nuclear missiles is possible, we would sit down with our allies and the Soviet Union to see how, together, we could replace all strategic ballistic missiles with such a defense, which threatens no one." October 13, 1986, and, in a nationwide address following his return from his Iceland summit meeting with Gorbachev, the president stated, "I offered a proposal that we continue our present research and, if and when we reached the stage of testing, we would sign now a treaty that would permit Soviet observation of such tests. And if the program was practical, we would eliminate our offensive missiles, and then we would share the benefits of advanced defenses." On the occasion of the 4th anniversary of the president's historic speech launching SDI, Senator Malcolm Wallop, RW, addressed a dinner sponsored by the High Frontier Organization. Wallop used the occasion to blast the Reagan administration for making SDI a research program for developing future technology that may never be deployed, instead of proceeding immediately with the deployment of existing technology. The senator cited in his speech examples of on-the-shelf technology. He claimed that, had the administration gone ahead with the boost-phase defensive weapon that Congress told it to build in 1981 and 1982, that weapon could now, tonight, destroy any missile ever built or designed in about a second at distances of up to 3,000 kilometers. If SDI were deployed, it presumably would be used as a defensive shield by the Soviet Union as well by the United States. But if the SDI research program were to continue without any deployment by the United States, then the danger exists that U.S. research on SDI could somehow be acquired by the Soviets and deployed only by them. In addition to SDI, Mr. Reagan has also supported the B-1 bomber, the MX missile, and other weapons programs. Disarmament. Mr. Reagan opposes a nuclear weapons freeze, but supports reductions in the levels of armaments. In 1981, Mr. Reagan committed the United States to seeking arms reductions agreements with the Soviet Union and proposed the complete elimination of a whole category of intermediate-range nuclear forces, INF. In the past, US-Soviet arms agreements had limited armaments to specified levels but had not reduced existing stockpiles. In November 1985, Mr. Reagan and Gorbachev met in Geneva for their first summit meeting. They agreed to move ahead with work on a treaty that would cut offensive nuclear weapons by 50%. On May 27, 1986, Mr. Reagan announced that the United States would no longer use the terms of SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 2 as a basis for U.S. defense policies. Nevertheless, for several months Mr. Reagan continued to abide informally by the treaty, as had Mr. Carter before him. This adherence led the Reagan administration to scrap old weapons as new ones were deployed. Yet, because the Senate failed to ratify it, SALT II never legally existed. Even if it had, it would have expired at the end of 1985, almost 5 months before Mr. Reagan's announcement. In October 1986, Mr. Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, where Mr. Reagan proposed the complete elimination of all US and Soviet ballistic missiles by 1996. In December 1987, the two met in Washington and signed the INF Treaty. The treaty, which still must be ratified by the US Senate, eliminates an entire class of nuclear missiles. In a nationwide address following the Washington summit meeting, Mr. Reagan pointed out that this treaty represents a landmark in post-war history, because it is not just an arms control but an arms reduction agreement. He stated in the same address that he and Gorbachev did some important planning for a Moscow summit next year. We agreed that we must redouble our efforts to reach agreements on reducing the levels of US and Soviet long-range or strategic nuclear arms, as I have proposed in the START, Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, negotiations. In this year's State of the Union address, January 25, Mr. Reagan reported that we are within reach of a START agreement. The Moscow summit meeting between Mr. Reagan and Gorbachev has since been scheduled for May 29 to June 2. Soviet treaty violations. Mr. Reagan has submitted a series of reports to Congress on Soviet non-compliance with arms control agreements, January 1984, February and December 1985, March 1987, and the 1984 report on Soviet non-compliance prepared for Mr. Reagan by the Independent General Advisory Committee on Arms Control. In his December 23, 1985 report, Mr. Reagan stated, "The administration's most recent studies support its conclusion that there is a pattern of Soviet non-compliance. As documented in this and previous reports, the Soviet Union has violated its legal obligation under, or political commitment to, the SALT I-ABM Treaty and Interim Agreement, the SALT II Agreement, the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, the Geneva Protocol on Chemical Weapons, and the Helsinki Final Act. In addition, the USSR has likely violated provisions of the Threshold Test Ban Treaty." Mr. Reagan's report of December 2, 1987 was submitted just 6 days before he signed the INF Treaty with Gorbachev. In it he noted, "The compliance concerns enumerated in this report are not unfamiliar to the Soviet Union. I expressed my personal interest in these issues directly to General Secretary Gorbachev during my meetings with him, both in 1985 in Geneva and then again in Reykjavik in October 1986. Most recently Secretary of State Shultz raised U.S. concerns about Soviet non-compliance during his October 1987 visit to Moscow. Nevertheless, in a letter accompanying this report to the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, Mr. Reagan noted, "The Soviet Union to date has not corrected its non-compliance activities. Indeed, since the last report, there has been an additional case of Soviet violation of the ABM Treaty in the deployment of an ABM radar at Gomel, and other violations are continuing." Friends and enemies. Most Americans applauded their president when he launched his Grenada rescue mission on October 25, 1983, coming as it did just 2 days after the terrorist truck bomb attack in Beirut, and less than 2 months after the Soviet attack on Cal Flight 007. The Grenada rescue gave freedom-loving people everywhere something to cheer about. Nevertheless, the record shows that this instance of opposition to communism is out of step with many other Reagan administration policies. Afghanistan. The Afghan Accords were signed by the Afghan puppet government in Pakistan, and guaranteed by the United States and the Soviet Union, on April 14 of this year. The Accords call for a phased withdrawal of all foreign troops, to be completed by early 1989, but make no mention of the 10,000 Soviet advisors who were already in place in Afghanistan prior to the Soviet military invasion. The Soviet Union and the United States have agreed not to arm any of the Afghan factions and to respect Afghanistan's neutrality, and Pakistan has agreed not to harbor the Afghan freedom fighters. The Afghan freedom fighters were not a party to these accords, they were represented by Pakistan. Communist China. On August 30, 1982, Mr. Reagan determined that it is in the national interest for the Export-Import Bank of the United States to extend a credit and guarantee in the aggregate amount of $68,425,000 to the People's Republic of China in connection with its purchase of steel-making equipment and related services. Presidential Determination No. 8219, in September 1982. The Reagan administration reversed previous policy and approved the shipment to Red China of a sophisticated computer system used by the U.S. military and NASA for highly accurate missile flight simulation. In November 1983, Commerce Department officials announced the lifting of restrictions on the export of up to $2 billion worth of high technology to Red China. According to the Dallas Morning News, November 23, 1983, the officials said that the move will remove curbs on about 75% of China's requests for high technology from the United States. The acceleration of technology transfers to the Red Chinese caused a logjam at the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, COCOM. This led the United States to obtain allied support to exempt much of the technology trade with Red China from COCOM screening. The exemption took effect in December 1985. Military transfers. When he was running for president in 1980, Mr. Reagan told the Los Angeles Times that the Soviets and Red Chinese were allies, and the only argument that caused their split was an argument over how best to destroy us. He also said that he would not entrust the Red Chinese with U.S. weapons because they could turn right around and the day after tomorrow discover that they and the Soviets have more in common than they have with us. Nevertheless, in June 1981, Secretary of State Alexander Haig announced from Peking that the Reagan administration had agreed in principle to sell military equipment to the Red Chinese. On June 12, 1984, Mr. Reagan found that the furnishing of defense articles and services to the government of China will strengthen the security of the United States and promote world peace. Presidential Determination No. 8411. In January 1985, the Reagan administration announced that it had reached a preliminary understanding with Red China to sell that communist government advanced anti-submarine equipment. In 1986, the Red Chinese purchased $1 million worth of Mark 46 anti-submarine torpedoes. The sale was part of a package deal that included the subsequent training, in 1987, of 7 Red Chinese students at the Naval Training Center's Advanced Undersea Weapons School at Orlando, Florida. According to a Pentagon spokesman, this was the first time that students from Red China or any other communist country were enrolled in a U.S. military training course. In April 1986, the Reagan administration announced its plans to sell $550 million of advanced aircraft navigational and other equipment to the Red Chinese. The package would enable a pilot to fly in any kind of weather day or night and included a panel allowing the pilot to electronically detect, track and fire at distant airplanes without having to take his eyes off the airspace in front of his craft. Congress had 30 days to block the sale but failed to do so, and the agreement was signed in November 1986. 2 months earlier, Red China had also agreed to pay $98 million for the U.S. specifications for a modern 155mm ammunition factory in Red China. Although Mr. Reagan has worked to build up the Red Chinese military, he has taken a different approach to the Republic of China on Taiwan. On August 17, 1982, the President issued a joint communiqué with Red China. The communiqué stated that the United States would hold future arms sales to the Republic of China below 1,979.82 levels and would ultimately halt them. It also reaffirmed U.S. recognition of the Red Chinese regime as the sole legal government of China, and acknowledged the Red Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. In light of Mr. Reagan's Red Chinese policies, it should not be surprising that, on the return trip from a visit to Red China, he stated at a stopover in Fairbanks, Alaska, May 1, 1984. "Now, I know there's been much said about my anti-communism. Well, I'm an anti-communist if you talk about communism for the United States. And in some communist regimes, I'm very critical of their violation of human rights and so forth. But I have never thought that it was necessary for us to impose our form of government on some other country. The communists don't share that view. They do seem to be expansionist. Except that I found that our Chinese leaders I was talking with have no expansionist ideas at all. They're resistant to that. So, as far as I'm concerned, we can live at peace in the world together. If they prefer socialism or communism and we prefer the democracy that we have, we may know that ours is best, but, we won't say that to them." Later in his remarks, Mr. Reagan referred to Red China as a so-called communist country. Lebanon. In August 1982, Mr. Reagan sent U.S. Marines to Lebanon to help oversee the evacuation of thousands of PLO terrorists who had been trapped in West Beirut by the Israeli army. Later in the year, Mr. Reagan again deployed U.S. Marines. On October 27, 1983, following the truck bombing of the U.S. Marine Headquarters building, Mr. Reagan explained in a nationwide address why they were there, to help bring peace to Lebanon and stability to the vital Middle East. To that end, the multinational force was created to help stabilize the situation in Lebanon until a government could be established and a Lebanese army mobilized to restore Lebanese sovereignty over its own soil as the foreign forces withdrew. That was the official objective. The practical effect was the rescue of the terrorist PLO from destruction by the Israeli army. Nicaragua. Mr. Reagan stated in a message to Congress on March 14, 1986, "Communist rulers do not voluntarily or in a single step relinquish control and open their nations to popular rule." 2 days later, the President said in a nationwide address, "For our own security, the United States must deny the Soviet Union a beachhead in North America." He recommended in that speech that the United States give assistance to the Contras in their war against the communist Sandinistas who have subjugated Nicaragua. The purpose of this U.S.-assisted effort, however, was not to topple the Sandinista regime but to force the Sandinista communists to accept negotiated reforms that would supposedly lead to a democratic society. For instance, on August 5, 1986, Mr. Reagan stated, "I must stress that neither the democratic resistance, the Contras, nor our administration seeks a purely military solution. Instead, the freedom fighters seek leverage to bring the communists to the table and negotiate a political, and democratic, peace." On November 19, 1986, Mr. Reagan was asked during a news conference if he would consider breaking diplomatic relations with Nicaragua to increase the pressure on the Sandinista government. He answered, "No, the Contras have made it plain that all they seek is to be able to put enough pressure on the Sandinista government for that government to negotiate with them and the people of Nicaragua for the kind of government that they all together had promised when they were fighting the revolution against the Somoza dictatorship." Presumably, If the Reagan administration really did seek the overthrow of the communist regime in Nicaragua, it would withdraw official diplomatic recognition from the Sandinistas and give it instead to a Nicaraguan government in exile made up of Contra leaders. Instead, Mr. Reagan has supported the Contadora process, culminating in the Arias peace plan. On October 7, 1987, Mr. Reagan told a meeting of the Organization of American States, OAS, that this historic agreement signed by the 5 Central American presidents August 7, contains many of the elements necessary to bring both lasting peace and enduring democracy to the region. The accord calls on all parties to end the fighting and insist on true democracy and human rights in Nicaragua, including freedom of the press, freedom of worship, etc. It also leaves the Sandinista communists in place. Persian Gulf. Mr. Reagan decided in 1987 to provide U.S. naval escort to U.S.-flagged Kuwaiti oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. This decision caused U.S. policy to tilt toward the Iraq side of the Iran-Iraq War, Kuwait being an ally of Iraq. It also tilted U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union's interests in the region since Iraq is a Soviet client state. Mr. Reagan was correct when he explained in a speech on August 26, 1987, WE found a parallel interest with the Soviet Union in a political end to the Iran-Iraq War. Poland. On December 17, 1981, Mr. Reagan stated during a news conference that it will be impossible for us to continue trying to help Poland solve its economic problems while martial law is imposed on the people of Poland, thousands are imprisoned, and the legal rights of free trade unions, previously granted by the government, are now denied. In January 1982, when the Polish government failed to repay the $71.3 million that it owed U.S. banks, Mr. Reagan decided to have the Commodity Credit Corporation, part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which had guaranteed the loans, acquire the debt and pay the $71.3 million without first requiring the obligatory declaration of default. In December 1984, the Reagan administration lifted its objections to Polish membership in the IMF. Romania. On May 20, 1981, Mr. Reagan determined that it is in the national interest for the Export-Import Bank of the United States to extend a credit in the amount of $120,742,500 to the Socialist Republic of Romania in connection with its purchase of 2 nuclear steam turbine generators and related services and spare parts. Presidential Determination No. 81-7. South Africa. It is widely known that Mr. Reagan opposed the South Africa Sanctions Bill, officially known as the Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, which was passed over the president's veto in the fall of 1986. It is not so widely known that, more than 1 year prior to the enactment of the Sanctions Bill, the president unilaterally declared his own sanctions against this anti-communist country. In Executive Order 12532, issued on September 9, 1985, the President declared, I, Ronald Reagan, President of the United States of America, find that the policies and actions of the government of South Africa constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the foreign policy and economy of the United States and hereby declare a national emergency to deal with that threat. The executive order banned the importation of crugerans and imposed other sanctions. The question arises, why did Mr. Reagan oppose the sanctions bill? The answer: the administration's disagreement with the Congress was not over objectives but over the means of achieving them. On December 4, 1986, Secretary of State George Shultz explained, the premises of our policy were re-examined in the domestic debate that preceded the latest round of U.S. sanctions. That debate once again made clear that the principles underlying this administration's policy, many of which are codified in the Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, are shared by all Americans. The recent controversy over sanctions was, thus, over the means, not the ends, of our policy. On July 22, 1986, Mr. Reagan proposed that the South African government 1. Set a timetable for the elimination of its apartheid laws. 2. Release all political prisoners. 3. Release Nelson Mandela and allow him to participate in the political process. 4. Lift the ban on black political movements. And 5. Initiate a dialogue with its opponents. In the same speech he claimed, the root cause of South Africa's disorder is apartheid. The communist-dominated African National Congress, which seeks the violent overthrow of the South African government, has been responsible for much of the disorder. Yet, Secretary of State George Shultz met with ANC head Oliver Tambo on January 28, 1987, thereby lending credibility to this terrorist organization. Soviet Union. In an address before a convention of the National Association of Evangelicals on March 8, 1983, Mr. Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. On November 21, 1985, he told a joint session of Congress, "These past 40 years have not been an easy time for the West or for the world. You know the facts, there is no need to recite the historical record. Suffice it to say that the United States cannot afford illusions about the nature of the USSR. We cannot assume that their ideology and purpose will change." On November 30, 1987, he said in an address at a Heritage Foundation luncheon that the Soviets spend billions to maintain or impose communist rule abroad, from Eastern Europe to Cuba, Cambodia, South Yemen, Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, and Afghanistan. But Mr. Reagan claimed in an interview with television anchormen 3 days later that, although leader after leader of the Soviet Union has declared his pledge that they would observe the Marxian concept of expansionism, that the future lay in a one-world, communist state, we now have, in Gorbachev, a leader that is apparently willing to say, or has never made that claim, but is willing to say that he's prepared to live with other philosophies in other countries. Since Mr. Reagan's first summit meeting with that Soviet leader in 1985, there has been, in addition to the INF agreement, an expansion of cultural, educational, and scientific exchanges between the two countries. And an expansion of trade. Mr. Reagan told the graduating class at Eureka College, Peoria, Illinois, on May 9, 1982, East-West trade was expanded in the hope of providing incentives for Soviet restraint, but the Soviets exploited the benefits of trade without moderating their behavior. In a letter to the US-USSR Trade and Economic Council, dated December 6, 1985, Mr. Reagan stated, "The United States government supports the development of non-strategic trade with the Soviet Union." In a speech on October 3, 1983 to the Heritage Foundation, Ronald Reagan cited as one of his achievements, "We have significantly slowed the transfer of valuable free world technology to the Soviet Union." Syndicated columnist William Safire commented, Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, October 10, 1983, "Perhaps the president had in mind the illegal shipments of high-tech supplies and computers, but when it comes to the transfer of valuable free world technology that will strategically benefit the Soviet Union, it was during the Reagan administration that the floodgates were opened." Safire claimed, "Not only do we aid the Russians militarily, we strengthen them economically and strategically." On August 1, 1986, Secretary of Agriculture Richard Ling announced the administration's decision to sell subsidized wheat to the Soviet Union. In response to the decision, Mr. Reagan's own Secretary of State, George Shultz, complained, "The Soviet Union must be chortling and scratching their heads about a system that says we're going to fix it up so that American taxpayers make it possible for a Soviet housewife to buy American-produced food at prices lower than an American housewife." In January 1987, the Reagan administration lifted an 8-year ban on the export of most U.S. oil field equipment and technology. On January 19 of this year, The New York Times reported that Mr. Reagan has opened the door to Soviet memberships in the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This April, Secretary of Commerce William Verity and 500 U.S. businessmen and government officials journeyed to Moscow to discuss joint ventures between U.S. and Soviet firms. In these arrangements, the Soviets would retain 51% ownership. Yugoslavia. On July 8, 1981, and again on October 1, 1982, Mr. Reagan made presidential determinations, Nos. 81-11 and 83-1, with regard to international military education and training for Yugoslavia. Both determinations stated that the furnishing of assistance to Yugoslavia is vital to the security of the United States, that Yugoslavia is not controlled by the international communist conspiracy, and that such assistance will further promote the independence of Yugoslavia from international communism. Captive Nations Week. As have other presidents before him, each year Mr. Reagan has proclaimed the third week of July Captive Nations Week. The week is a time to remember the citizens of other nations who live under communist tyranny. On July 21, 1986, Mr. Reagan stated just before signing that year's Captive Nations Week proclamation, "I'm proud that, during these last 5.5 years, we've kept faith with the people of the captive nations. To be true to ourselves, we must remain true to them. So many who live under communism see us as their only hope." United Nations. On September 22, 1983, the U.S. Senate passed an amendment to reduce the level of U.S. contributions to the United Nations. Specifically, the amendment would restrict payments by the United States to the United Nations and its affiliated agencies in calendar year 1984 to no more than U.S. payments in calendar year 1980, and would reduce these payments in each of calendar years 1985, 1986, and 1987 by an amount equal to 10% of these payments in calendar year 1980 for an estimated total reduction of $500 million. On October 31, 1983, Mr. Reagan wrote to Senator Charles Percy, chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, to express his opposition to this amendment. The measure would, according to Mr. Reagan, drastically reduce U.S. assessed contributions to the United Nations and four affiliated international organizations. Moreover, it would place the United States in default of its legal obligations in a manner that would jeopardize United States voting rights in their affected international organizations. The President stated in the same letter, "There must be no doubt about this country's support for the United Nations. The United Nations plays a vital role in advancing United States foreign policy interests. We must join with other governments who share our views to ensure that the UN and these organizations function with the efficiency and effectiveness required by the global challenges they face." PLO Office. As passed by the Congress in December 1987, the fiscal 1988 State Department authorization bill contained a provision that called for the closure of the New York office of the terrorist Palestine Liberation Organization. The office serves as the headquarters of the PLO's observer mission to the UN. On March 11, 1988, in order to carry out this mandate, U.S. Attorney General Ed Meese formally ordered the PLO's New York office closed by March 21. The closure of the PLO office, however, did not delight the Reagan administration. U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz criticized Meese's order, but pointed out that, because of the law, he had no choice. Shultz described the provision as a bad piece of legislation, one of the dumber things Congress has done lately. On March 22, after the PLO had defied the U.S. deadline, the U.S. Justice Department filed a lawsuit aimed at forcing the closure of the PLO office. The following day, the UN General Assembly, meeting in special session, voted 148-2 to condemn the United States for this action. Israel was the only country to vote with the United States. UN speeches. The President has on a number of occasions dignified the United Nations by addressing its General Assembly. On September 22, 1986, he told the UN General Assembly, "The United States remains committed to the United Nations." For over 40 years, This organization has provided an international forum for harmonizing conflicting national interests and has made a significant contribution in such fields as peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, and eradicating disease. Later in the same speech he added, "You have my word for it. My country, which has always given the United Nations generous support, will continue to play a leading role in the effort to achieve its noble purposes." Cal Flight 007. On September 5, 1983, Mr. Reagan addressed the nation on the Korean airline massacre, the attack by the Soviet Union against 269 innocent men, women, and children aboard an unarmed Korean passenger plane. The president continued, "This crime against humanity must never be forgotten, here or throughout the world." In response to the Soviet attack, Mr. Reagan requested permission to send U.S. vessels into Soviet waters to search for wreckage and bodies, but the request was not granted. He reaffirmed an order that had, since 1981, denied Aeroflot the right to fly to the United States, and, 3 days following his September 5 speech, he ordered Aeroflot to close both of the offices it operated in the United States. He encouraged other nations not to accept Aeroflot as a normal member of the international civil air community, and he urged the International Civil Aviation Organization to investigate the crime. He also asked the U.S. Congress to pass a joint resolution condemning the Soviet crime. On September 15, 1983, the U.S. Senate completed congressional action on this resolution by passing it 95-0. Prior to doing so, however, it considered a series of measures, offered by Senator Jesse Helms, RNC, that were intended to give the resolution more clout. Ronald Reagan strongly opposed the Helms measures, and the Senate, following the president's recommendation, voted to kill every one of them. The measures that Mr. Reagan helped to kill would have expressed the sense of Congress that the president should 1. Recall the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union for urgent consultations. 2. Conduct a comprehensive reappraisal of the complete spectrum of United States-Soviet relations, including arms control, human rights, East-West trade, and regional issues. 3. Report to the Congress on the record of Soviet compliance or non-compliance with the letter and spirit of all existing strategic arms limitation talks, SALT, agreements and other arms control agreements to which the Soviet Union is a party. 4. Direct the United States negotiators at the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks at Geneva to link the possible success of such talks with the willingness of the Soviet Union to abide by international law as a responsible member of the community of nations, paying specific attention to the Cal 7 massacre, Soviet violations of the Helsinki Accords, the Soviet invasion and subjugation of Afghanistan, the repression of Poland and its free labor movement, and the use of chemical and biological weapons in contravention of existing treaties. 5. Re-emphasize the inconsistency of the Soviet military presence in the Western Hemisphere with the Monroe Doctrine. 6. Tighten substantially the foreign policy and military controls over the export of machine tools, high-technology products, and equipment for the development of Soviet oil and gas resources. 7. Direct the Secretary of the Treasury to use existing statutory authority to prevent the import of any product or material produced in the Soviet Union with the use of forced labor. Mr. Reagan also opposed an amendment, offered by Senator Walter Huddleston, D.C., that would have specified 8. The United States hereby declares its intent to reduce substantially the Soviet official presence within the United States in order to establish real equivalence with the official United States presence in the Soviet Union. Unlike Helms, liberal Senator Edward Kennedy, DMA, defended the president's handling of the tragedy. On November 21, 1985, after Mr. Reagan had returned from his Geneva summit meeting with Gorbachev, he stated in a nationwide address, "We have also, together with the government of Japan, concluded a Pacific Air Safety Agreement with the Soviet Union. This is designed to set up cooperative measures to improve civil air safety in that region of the Pacific." What happened before must never be allowed to happen there again. What had happened there before, the Soviet attack on Flight 007, was not specifically referred to by the President in his address. Genocide Treaty. President Harry Truman transmitted the Genocide Convention to the Senate in 1949. The Senate considered it intermittently between 1950 and 1986, when it finally voted for ratification. Ratification of the dangerous treaty took 37 years because of legitimate concerns that it would subject Americans charged with genocide to jurisdiction of international law without the protection of the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. In spite of the dangers, the treaty was ratified after it received a key endorsement from a surprising source, Ronald Reagan. On September 5, 1984, the Reagan administration announced its support for the Genocide Treaty. The significance of this action did not escape Senator William Proxmire, D.W., who for many years had led the fight in the Senate for ratification. The very next day, the senator told his colleagues, "Why, yesterday may have been the biggest day for the ratification of the Genocide Convention in the 35 years that treaty has been pending before the Senate. Yesterday the Reagan administration affirmed its support of the treaty." The Reagan administration is far and away in the strongest position to give the Genocide Treaty the kind of decisive support it needs to win Senate ratification. Why is this? Because the Reagan administration is a conservative administration. Its conservative credentials can only be challenged by the super-conservative truly far-right. If this administration concludes the treaty is legally as well as morally right, then what credible basis is there for any genuinely conservative opposition? In the wake of the Reagan endorsement, Senator Jesse Helms, RNC, proposed two understandings to the treaty: 1, that legislation needed to implement the treaty cannot conflict with the U.S. Constitution, and 2, that the United States would not accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, World Court, in domestic matters, except as determined by the United States. In response, Reagan administration officials from the State and Justice Departments argued in hearings before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the Helms understandings were incompatible with the treaty's purpose. On September 19, 1984, the Foreign Relations Committee voted the treaty to the Senate floor 17-0. Helms voted present. Then Helms and other conservative senators used procedural delaying tactics and the threat of amendments to block a further action during the waning days of the 98th Congress. In the 99th Congress, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee again held hearings on the Genocide Treaty. The Reagan administration, reversing its earlier position, announced support for a reservation by Helms to allow the United States to exempt itself from the World Court jurisdiction. Then, on May 21, 1985, the committee sent the Genocide Treaty to the floor, but this time with 8 Helms-sponsored devices attached, 2 reservations, 5 understandings and a declaration. The devices were intended to protect U.S. interests and were collectively known as the Sovereignty Package. They did not carry the same clout as actual amendments to the treaty, however, and were of questionable legal value. According to Senator Steve Sims, RID, who is not a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, the Sovereignty Package did nothing to alter the treaty's inherent flaws. On October 8, 1986, Senator John Kerry, DMA, and 45 other senators wrote to the president urging him to seek ratification of the treaty before the November summit meeting with Gorbachev. In their letter, the senators said that they were concerned with the statement by then Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole, RKS, who informed us he would not schedule time for consideration of the Genocide Convention by the Senate until he received a letter from you, Mr. Reagan, requesting that the Senate take up the convention. Mr. Reagan wrote Dole on October 16 with the request that the Senate act this year. The Senate did not act by the end of the year, but finally ratified the Genocide Treaty on February 19, 1986 by a vote of 83 to 11. After the vote, Proxmire boasted that Mr. Reagan's support of the Genocide Treaty cut the ground right out from under the right wing. The senator was correct. Martin Luther King holiday. The House passed the Martin Luther King holiday bill on August 2, 1983. Regarding the legislation, Mr. Reagan stated in a letter, dated October 3, to former New Hampshire Governor Melvin Thompson, "I have the same reservations you have, but here the perception of too many people is based on an image, not reality. Indeed, to them the perception is reality." The president was responding to a letter he received from Thompson that characterized the holiday as honoring the memory of a man of immoral character whose frequent associations with leading agents of communism is well established. The Senate passed the King holiday bill on October 19, 1983. On that same date, Mr. Reagan commented during a nationally televised press conference, "Since they seem bent on making it a national holiday, I believe that symbolism of that day is important enough that I'll sign that legislation when it reaches my desk." He signed it on November 2. 14 months later, on the occasion of King's birthday, January 15, 1985, the president stated, "Martin Luther King knew that America's democracy was imperfect, but he also knew that America's conscience was a powerful force for reform. His unique combination of moral leadership and practical political wisdom enlisted America's conscience on the side of peaceful change." The memory of Martin Luther King is engraved in the hearts and minds of his fellow Americans. It is appropriate that we remember him today and that we remember and honor the values for which he stood. Trilateral Commission, CFR. While on the campaign trail in 1980, Mr. Reagan criticized President Carter for having in his administration 19 present or former members of the Trilateral Commission.